What's up, everyone? Japan's third week numbers are in, and I think there are some very interesting talking points. Or, at the very least, very interesting to me. First and foremost, I think it's very important to reiterate that, according to experts, launch week sales are entirely about how many consoles you have available and not about how much demand there is. Because everybody sells out early on. Some of them do it in 24 hours, others take a few days to get there, but they all sell out. And the next thing that experts like to point out is that the immediate drop-off after launch week also doesn't mean much because it's entirely indicative of nothing more than most people buying in when it's first available. So just like everybody predicted from early on, the Nintendo Switch 2 had a whole lot of units available because they delayed their launch, and they had a massive drop-off from week 1 to week 2 because they had so many more units available. And likewise, the Japanese sales continued with another minor drop-off from last week's numbers. Now, the question is if they're going to start to pick up at some point. Usually, the past couple of Nintendo consoles have just about doubled their numbers throughout the remainder of the month as they did on the launch weekend. I just don't know if that's going to happen with the Switch 2 because they had more units available up front. But just like with last week, it seems like all of that initial hype is more or less dying down. Not to say there's not hype or demand for the Switch 2, but I mean all of the ridiculous estimates that were assuming they would hit absurd numbers week by week, just like they did on launch weekend. And you know it's died down because outside of the most hardcore of Nintendo forums, nobody's really talking about this. Outside of that, you have a little bit more of what you'd expect. Given that the attachment rate for Mario Kart World being the only real Nintendo game that anybody wants to play is over 85%. Naturally, with more Switch 2 sold, more Mario Kart World games are sold as well, and they've reached 1 million in Japan. Of course, these do include the bundles because the bundles count as physical sales. And while I still expect that Mario Kart World will end up being the best-selling game on the Nintendo Switch 2, the rumors are that this bundle will only exist until the end of 2025, so at some point that attachment rate should loosen up a bit. The funny thing is how far down you have to drop to see the next best-selling game on the Switch 2. You go from 122,000 Mario Kart World sales all the way down to Breath of the Wild, Nintendo Switch 2 edition, which makes sense. This is just a port of the Switch 1 game. Most people will just upgrade. But there is a more interesting discussion in that the next game beyond that is Raidou Remastered: The Mystery of the Soulless Army. Now, this game released on June 19th. It had a fairly respectable showing across all consoles, but it sold almost 4 times as many units on the Nintendo Switch 1 than it did on the Nintendo Switch 2. Now, obviously, this could mean a number of things. There is a significantly larger Switch 1 user base than there is a Switch 2 user base in Japan. But given how many Switch 2 units have been sold already, and how few games are actually available on the Nintendo Switch 2 at the moment, Raidou Remastered managed less than 0.5% attachment rate with the Nintendo Switch 2, based off of these numbers, of course. As per usual, these don't include digital sales, and they don't include My Nintendo Store sales. But that's pretty much the case with all of the data that we get. Now, between the PS5 and the Nintendo Switch 1, Raidou Remastered got a pretty healthy turnout, 40,000 units. And the PS4 also sold just about as many as the Nintendo Switch 2. So the game didn't really do poorly, but it had a bad showing on the Nintendo Switch 2. And like I said, that could just be because the Switch 2 is still new and it does not have enough people that want to buy games for it, with Nintendo fans clearly showing that they only want to buy first-party titles. But I think it's obviously more than that. Despite the fact that Raidou Remastered on the Nintendo Switch 2 is the superior version, basically you have a guaranteed 1080p 60 frames per second regardless of whether you play docked or handheld, as opposed to the 720 potentially 30 frames per second that you would get on the Switch 1. Despite that better performance, people have opted to buy the Switch 1 version, and that's because the Switch 2 version is on a game key card. I would not be surprised if a ton of Switch 2 users ended up opting for the Switch 1 version for the physical because they wanted an actual physical game and not something on a game key card. Sega and Atlus have not provided an upgrade path for this game, so it's not like they decided to buy the cheaper Switch 1 version to pay for the upgrade pack either. But I think this is a very clear reality of what the Nintendo Switch 2 is going to face from a third-party perspective, especially for people that are more interested in buying physical, which a lot of Nintendo fans are. If you're going to have two versions available on cartridge for the Switch 1 and the Switch 2, many people are going to be willing to pay that extra $10 for the better performance, but they will not be willing to have to buy a game key card for the better performance. Now, I think technically when Raidou Remastered on the Switch 1 is docked, it plays with the same resolution and frame rate as on the Switch 2, so that undoubtedly affects it as well. But as many people have pointed out, when you play these games on the Switch 2, there's always just a better performance in general because it's a stronger console. So even with the same resolution and frame rate, you would realistically expect that it would run better on the Switch 2. But despite that, it's not worth it to people to have to buy a game key card, which everybody knows. But I do want to reiterate something that I mentioned a few videos ago, and earlier I alluded to it as well. At the end of the day, this matters very little, because overwhelmingly, Nintendo consoles are strictly for first-party games by a very large margin. I just wonder if that margin is going to be even larger considering all of the game key cards that the third parties are undoubtedly going to lead towards because Nintendo is overcharging for the 64GB cartridges. Now, I don't know if this is confirmed or not, but apparently Sega is putting Sonic Crossworlds on an actual cartridge. So there's a very good chance early on, based off of the sales that they saw in the opening couple of weeks, they've opted to let Nintendo win and pay for the more expensive cartridge, because otherwise they won't make any sales, effectively allowing Nintendo to strong-arm the third-party developers into paying for larger cartridges than they need to. But in fairness, Nintendo being terrible to third parties is hardly newsworthy. They've been doing this forever. There are some more interesting stuff here to see from the sales. The PlayStation 5 is no longer outselling the Nintendo Switch because the discounts are gone. And I think that's to be expected because in Japan, where the price is actually normal, the PlayStation 5 is usually significantly more expensive than everything else. Unlike over here, where the PlayStation 5 is the same price as the Nintendo Switch 2, because they are overcharging for the Nintendo Switch 2. You know what's also interesting that I didn't really notice until right now? So obviously, different economy, game prices are going to be different, right? So I'm not going to do a direct translation here. Like Mario Kart World in Japan is something like $62, and that's with tax included. Bonanza is a $55 game, again, tax included, but these are prices based off of regions. I can accept that. I can even accept that the Switch 2 is cheaper in Japan. Historically, Nintendo consoles are cheaper there, but usually the gap is like 15%. With the Switch 2, it's like 30-something%. But something I just noticed now that nobody really spoke about before is how much better of a deal the Mario Kart bundle in Japan was than what we got here in the States. The price difference between the Switch 2 alone and the Switch 2 with Mario Kart was 4,000 yen, which means for an extra $27 they got the bundle. But again, different region, different prices. I don't care that they only had to pay an extra $27 because $27 in Japan does not necessarily equal $27 elsewhere. But that means that in Japan, they effectively got Mario Kart World for 4,000 yen. That's like 55.5% off of the full price. Meanwhile, over here, we only got 37.5% off. Well, not we, because I didn't buy it, but, you know, as a whole, the people that did buy it. That means we should have been able to save another $14 on Mario Kart World if you bought it in a bundle, which would have meant that you would have gotten Mario Kart World included with your Nintendo Switch for like $485. And it's actually even worse than that because something that has also not really been discussed, all of these Japanese prices include tax. So everybody's been in an uproar because our bundle costs $125 more than the Japanese bundle. Meanwhile, the average US sales tax is 7.5% when you weight it based off of state populations. So if you do all of the math, when you pay for it in the United States, you're paying almost $165 more than you would if you were buying it in Japan. That is 33% more expensive. Which if you do the same math for the Switch OLED, for example, it's 19% more expensive in the States, which is more reasonable. The Switch Lite has an 18% difference. And likewise with the original Switch. As of 8 months ago, the PlayStation 5 is basically the same price in the West as it is in the East. And even prior to that price increase, it was all of like a 2% difference East and West. The point that I'm trying to make is that this argument of the weaker yen for the Switch 2 being cheaper in Japan doesn't make any sense. Because for every other console, the discrepancy between the West and the East is not as broad of a difference as it is for the Switch 2. And as I've been harping on for the past month, the reason it's very important to analyze the sales of the Nintendo Switch 2 in Japan is because it's doing significantly better in Japan than previous consoles did in proportion to the rest of the world. It is at least 1/3 of the entirety of that initial 3.5 million that was sold. Realistically, significantly more because of the My Nintendo store. It could be close to half, or more realistically, 40% of all the sales. And I think over time that's just going to become more and more clear. But we won't know for certain until we start getting more numbers. Now, take this with a major grain of salt, but I spoke to somebody at my local Best Buy. The employee there, which again could mean absolutely nothing because I don't know how much these employees actually know, suggested that Best Buy was notified by Nintendo that they shouldn't expect any more major console numbers coming in from now until 2026. And he explicitly told me that I should not expect that Best Buys are going to have any crazy Black Friday numbers nor Christmas numbers. So there's a good chance that what we saw at the launch of the Switch 2 is going to be a vast majority of what carries it through the end of the year. Now, it'll be interesting to see if everybody just got that initial 3.5 million and they're just burning through that now and that's the only number that's going around. Or maybe it's that initial 6 to 8 million units that have been reported by Bloomberg ahead of time, that there isn't enough demand to move all of those units around the world, so they're just going to slowly trickle those out throughout the rest of the year. But I think more realistically, if this indeed is true, this is Nintendo going for a second soft launch of the console by generating more fake hype. The same way they delayed the launch of the Nintendo Switch 2 in order to make sure they have a bunch of units there so they can put the big banners up there and say that we broke records, they're probably gonna just withhold more and more units again and then just have another major event where they launch a bunch of Switch 2s, manufacturing all of this scarcity and manufacturing all of this hype to continue on with the same trend. They want pandemic hype without a pandemic. That's what they want. There are no shortages, but they know that if they sell, 500,000 units a month for 6 months, that doesn't look as exciting. But if they spend the next 6 months teasing people, telling them that we're out of stock and working on more units, the same way they delayed the launch of the Nintendo Switch Pro in order to make it a Switch 2, leaving people on the edge of their seats for an upgrade, then those same 3 million units that would have been sold trickled out over time would look a lot more appealing if they all sold out at the beginning of 2025. There's a good chance Nintendo is drip feeding their consoles at this point and not just their games and not just their news on their Today app. I've been saying it, man. Manufactured hype. It's very clear. It's an excellent business strategy too. Don't get me wrong, but don't get suckered into it. And if all of this is indeed true and there's not going to be another major pump of Switch 2 consoles until next year, I wonder if the scalpers will finally start making money on their consoles. Realistically not, because at the time of the launch of this console, when people are most desperate to overspend as they have always overspent on scalpers over the past decade, the scalpers are still barely making enough to make it worth their while. Because this is clearly not a device as high in demand as people think it is. They just got enough stock available initially to meet their early numbers. Again, the PS5 was sold out on arrival until it hit 20 million units. If Nintendo is going to trickle out their launches, it might be the same thing. Every 6 to 8 months, they'll drop 3 million. But this is just not a console that people are unanimously on board trying to purchase. And I think that's just going to be clearer and clearer as time goes on. In any case, that's all I got for right now. Thank you for listening, and I will catch you on the next one. Actually, coming back in to discuss the summer sale, because right before I was about to upload, I saw that make the news. These are some good deals for some first-party titles that are pretty good. At least that's what would appear to many on the surface, because they just bought a Nintendo Switch 2 and found all of these first-party games go on sale. Keep in mind, some of these games are 8 years old. They shouldn't be on a summer sale. By now, they should be Nintendo Selects. But even despite that, as somebody pointed out online, this same sale, 5 years ago, they had way more first-party titles on sale. So don't take this and run with it because you think this is Nintendo dropping prices and making sales for the start of a new console. Even with their sales, they have gotten cheaper. Okay, now I'm out.